This is Barbara London calling. Welcome once again to my podcast series about the wild world of media art. I'm calling media artists from around the world, many of whom I've worked with as an author and curator. Together, we're exploring what motivates and inspires these artists and how they see the world as media artists working at the forefront of technology and creativity. Today I'm calling Iain Forsyth and Jane Pollard, two London-based artists and collaborators with a background in installation art and the moving image. Iain and Jane began their fruitful collaboration as students at Goldsmiths in London, where they saw firsthand the good and the bad of the so-called YBA movement of young British artists. Music has always played an important role in their work, culminating in their 2014 feature film, 20,000 Days on Earth, a musical docudrama starring the iconic singer-songwriter Nick Cave. Iain and Jane's work, Requiem for 114 Radios, which features 114 vintage radios simultaneously buzzing and broadcasting, will be featured in Seeing Sound, an upcoming exhibition I organize with Independent Curators International. Iain and Jane, thanks for joining me.
Very welcome.
Hello.
Your practice is so rich and varied. Let's begin with how your collaborative practice began during your second year at Goldsmiths College, where you were studying fine art and art theory. How did you get started working together?
The very first thing we did together actually was a publishing project. We, I guess, had both arrived at a point as students where we weren't particularly productive. We weren't producing an awful lot. And as we got to know each other better, I think we both had an interest in a kind of culture of making things happen, a culture that to me certainly was more familiar in the music scene, the kind of DIY fanzine scene and that kind of thing. And it just felt like we could do something, we could make something happen. There seemed to be no reason why not. So we began publishing a magazine that was based on art objects. So contributors to the magazine would produce an art multiple and we would sell them in curated boxes. And they were published 3 times a year from, I think, 94 to 97 or thereabouts. We did 10 issues in total.
It was called Words and Pictures, Ultra Paranoid, Extra Spatial, Portable Art. And each time we got a musician or an artist or a writer to contribute both a preface and another to do an introduction. And we worked with, Momus actually coined the title, the Ultra Paranoid, Extra Spatial, Portable Art, and wrote us a kind of, not a manifesto, but like an erratum to a manifesto for our first issue. We launched it at the ICA. I guess what I saw in Iain, let's give you a bit of context. Goldsmiths was fallow at that point. It was in the early 90s there was a strange period. There'd been such a rush of success for, artists coming out of the BA course, really kind of young in the kind of previous sort of 6-7 years. And it felt like there was no sense of rebellion there. It was all about kind of finding your thing and then doing your thing as best as possible, shiny, kind of getting it ready so it's ready for walls. And we just had no interest in that. It felt so unexciting. And at the same time, we were going to lots of gigs together and kind of both benefiting from the nightlife that London kind of offers you up as students, and felt like the way that small independent bands were able to connect to an audience, the sort of attitude of that, the immediacy of that, the exchange of that felt much more exciting. So Words and Pictures started almost like a fanzine, but instead of kind of writing about music, we asked artists to make multiples that could fit in the box, and together started a kind of interesting conversation.
Talking with you and doing some background reading, you noted Goldsmith was a place to get angry, and that most of your work was born out of that anger.
I mean, I think it's kind of your job as an art student to be angry. I think that anger is the energy that gets you through 3 years on a BA or whatever it might be. But yeah, Goldsmith to us at that time, I think just felt like it gave us so much to react against. It felt like kind of in the wake of the sort of vapor trail of that sort of YBA generation. You know, looking back, I think a lot of our contemporaries were being prepared for the market, prepared for the art market. And I guess the kind of interests we had were much more in a wider audience. You know, it felt like a lot of the things that were being done at Goldsmiths were being made really for an audience of one, and that audience was Charles Saatchi. And I think for us, as Jane was saying, the idea that, you know, a music event engages with an attending audience, I think is probably what ultimately meant that the very earliest work we did together was performance-based.
I mean, it's worth saying, you know, I grew up in Newcastle, and it wasn't the Dark Ages or anything, but there wasn't any contemporary art galleries, not that I knew of. Baltic didn't exist. You know, Sage wasn't there at this point. There was the Lang Gallery, and in the Lang Gallery you could see old paintings. I didn't really know that being a contemporary artist was a possible option. I didn't know what that would mean. So in this kind of 1 year of foundation I spent in Sunderland, my eyes were opened. I really began to say, oh my God, this is something you can actually do. Like, you can be this. So coming down to London, I think we both came with a lot of energy, but also with a total kind of lack of understanding of the sort of existing hierarchies and structures of the London art scene, or the art market. And yeah, as Iain said, the people we wanted to speak to was anybody, people like us, you know, young people that maybe like us didn't know about contemporary art, or weren't visiting galleries all the time.
So there was great energy that you found there.
Yeah, I think it's good to have something to kick against, and I think Goldsmith was, for us, the perfect sort of springboard for wanting to do something other.
Your sources of inspiration are quite diverse, and now I think we'll turn to 3 people in particular to discuss today: Bruce Nauman, Joshua Compston, and Nick Cave. Let's start with Bruce. I know that while you were at school, you saw Bruce's Good Boy, Bad Boy from 1985, which was the first work of video art to leave a mark on you. I want to know why.
For me, I didn't, standing in front of Good Boy, Bad Boy, I was laughing before I was thinking. I kept laughing. I was entertained. I couldn't understand it, but it was affecting me on an immediate, instant, visceral level. I didn't feel shut out from it. I didn't feel like I needed to understand some kind of something clever or some sort of secret code in which to decode it. I got it. I got what he was doing, and he was doing it again and again, and that repetition kind of breeds a sort of infectious humour to it. And yeah, I mean, it changed me. That there are those works in front of which you are just transformed. That you realise, that I can do that. He can do that. And then you the sort of the possibilities of what you can even think about are just exploded, and you sort of go running through the open doors trying to kind of find your own voice in it.
I think also it was a bit of a gateway drug, really. It sort of opened that door into a period of video art that hadn't really been on our radar. You know, it wasn't really talked about particularly in London in the mid-90s. It wasn't particularly fashionable at that point. Kind of had a renaissance a little while later, but just starting to dig into some of that generation, and particularly discovering for ourselves the work of Vito Acconci, just signalled so many possibilities that I think the galleries that we were able to access as young art students weren't really presenting to us. It was kind of a way of somehow looking back, felt like a way of looking forward.
Maybe there was also a kind of rhythm to the pattern of speech, definitely with Naumann, absolutely with Acconci, where they seem to be somehow borrowing something from music or from poetry or from the street even. There's an accessibility, but there's also this kind of rhythm. And that was something we knew. We knew rhythm from music. We knew rhythm from the poets and that we loved. And I think that seeing that you could engage, that you could kind of borrow from other art forms and pull across and make something from them, but, you know, within the world or the language or the blank canvas of contemporary art, that was exciting. That felt really exciting.
You know, we're practically pre-internet at this point, I guess, in the mid-90s. You know, I think we first didn't get an email address until 98, I think was our first email address. So it was kind of, you know, this information was still relatively hard to access, other than spending time trawling through the college library. And, you know, obviously it goes without saying, video art and performance art in books is not necessarily the most representative way to encounter it.
So the second person I want to ask you about was in 1993, you met Joshua Compton, and he was an often irritating prodigy who came up with innovative curatorial ideas that would later be quite widely adopted. And I gather he single-handedly turned the down-at-the-heels neighborhoods of Hoxton and Shoreditch into cultural capitals. How did he have an impact on your practice?
I mean, Joshua was like a bolt of lightning. He just sort of fell into our life out of nowhere and literally transformed it, completely opened our minds to ways of thinking about art engaging with a public, art engaging with the streets.
Art changing life. He was really kind of excited about the idea that as some kind of whirlwind kind of impresario, like Malcolm McLaren before him, and these kind of big ideas, you know, situationist ideas that we were going to apply to contemporary life in London and youth culture. That's what Joshua felt like. It felt like somebody that's kind of way ahead of his time or completely mad, who was constantly kind of spouting and promising and dreaming. And I think in us he saw, I mean, we were at Goldsmiths at the time. I think he saw hunger or kind of eagerness to do something or to practice in a way that is more accessible. And I think also kind of on his part, wholly selfishly, he saw two people that he could use to kind of almost begin to archive some of these ideas. So we would meet on the weekends and with a tape recorder and have breakfast together, and he'd just talk. I mean, we asked questions sometimes, but my God, he could talk. And then we would take those home, and on our tiny little word processors, we'd type them up, and then we'd fax them to him, and he'd amend them, and we'd get them faxed back with all of these notes on them. And we were making these kind of recordings and these documents that were charting kind of his ideas of the time. And sometimes I couldn't tell whether they were serious ideas or not. Some of the discussions that we had made it into printed, published articles in varying kind of independent magazines.
I think one of the things he really shared with Malcolm McLaren was that idea that you can talk something to the point of it becoming a reality. And Josh was very, very good at talking a good game, right?
Yeah, somehow if you tell enough people, you kind of implicating yourself into having to go through with it in some way, or that if it exists in enough consciousness, that then it has to become real. And you see it in the people that we met through him. So particularly Gavin Turk's work. We were introduced to Gavin and Deborah and to Gavin's work, which became really influential on us early doors, and on the kind of variety of kind of objects that he would be able to create, and the language that the conversations he was being able to have with past art as well. I think that was hugely kind of influential on us. But yeah, you can see it now. I see it still, that Joshua's influence is still there. It's still kind of, there are ramifications of it, not just in what's happened in Hoxton and Shoreditch, but also in the people that he kind of touched.
I mean, that was one of his greatest skills in a way, was people. He was, I guess the cynic might say, a great manipulator of people. I would perhaps say he was a great coordinator of people. He was very good at sort of gathering around him a community of people who not necessarily were like-minded, but shared enough objectives that he could kind of, probably use them, to be fair, in a way that got something out of that relationship for him, but usually also for the person he was working with. And I think it's something that we've sort of taken forward in our way of working, that sense of a community around you, of people that you can return to and people you can work with and trust over and over and over again, I think has become really, really important to us. And certainly over the last few years, you can kind of see it in actors that we've returned to and cinematographers we've returned to. There very much is a group of people now that I consider to be our kind of network.
I think there's also, people were his currency in an odd way. I can tell you this because he's not around anymore, and data protection laws definitely didn't exist back then. But for all the kind of bits of things and writing and whatever we did with him, he could never pay you. There was never any money around. But he would kind of pay you in kind. And one of the things he did was kind of produce this, it was like a ream of paper that he sort of slapped down on the table, and it was his mailing list. It was amazing. It was like and I'm sure the same versions of this mailing list were kind of passing hands around, varying young artists in London.
I think the story goes that he'd actually originally stolen it from Anthony Duffo when he worked as an art handler in the gallery, as a student himself when he was at the Courtauld. But yeah, this mailing list was the sort of springboard to launching Words and Pictures. That's why he gave it to us. And, again, it was just much harder to access information at that point. And suddenly having this document that enabled us to contact the great and the good of the London, if not global art world, was a remarkable gift.
So there's another person I want to talk about with you, who you have a lot of connection with over the years, and that's Nick Cave, the very iconic singer-songwriter. You've collaborated several times, including your fantastic first feature-length film, 20,000 Days on Earth from 2014. So I'd love to know what you learned from Nick Cave.
Nick is incredibly impressive, and in a way he also embodies something of that delicious mixture of the absolutely accessible and the kind of ambitiously kind of philosophical or mythological in a way. There's something about, and there's some of that's his Australianness, I'm sure, but there's something of that loftiness and then that utter debased humour, down-to-earthness, and that combination in anybody is absolutely kind of intoxicating, and definitely we were really attracted to that in Nick. And I think in a way now almost all of our thinking and our practice kind of owes something to Nick, and owes something to the huge transformation that happened to us whilst we were making 20,000 Days on Earth, where we found that we were able to take ideas that we had been grappling with from way back, from those days in Goldsmiths, and somehow find mode of being able to explore them and to articulate them and to resolve, in some cases, them in the language of film, which, I'd never guessed that we could do that. And Nick makes you feel like almost anything's possible.
Yeah, he's a great advocate. I mean, there's things that we did at the request of Nick with no formal or even informal kind of qualification to do whatsoever. I mean, the one that always stands out to me was when he wrote his last novel, The Death of Bunny Munro, and did a reading tour where he went on the road and did some book readings and played a few songs with a stripped down band. And Nick asked us to come on the tour and do the lighting and the stage show for that tour. Now, that's not something we've done, it's not something we know how to do, but Nick just kind of had this idea that we'd be good at it, we'd be capable of it, and trusted us. And I think for somebody in a position to pretty much pick and choose who he wants to work with, to say to you, no, you'll be fine, just give it a go, it'll be good, was again just a remarkable amount of trust and confidence to give to someone.
The thing that I think the biggest gift or the biggest influence that Nick has had on us is, I think, us beginning to understand what it was we didn't like about a lot of the work being made around kind of cultural figures or musicians or artists, which is that there's this kind of semi-journalistic, quasi-observational tendency to try and strip away the mythology of the person, and then at the same time somehow over-mythologize their art or their practice. So you're saying, the person doing their shopping or cooking their dinner like a normal person, and then there's a sort of smoke and mirrors kind of confusion or cloud around the work that they're doing, the art that they're making. And I don't know at the point that it clicked, that we understood that actually you have to turn that, to be interesting, you need to turn that on its head and actually work with the mythology of the person that they've already started to kind of create in the way they look, in their lyrics, in their language, in their moves. You work with that, you enhance that, you build upon that, and then you strip away the mythology around the art. Because truth is, anybody can make something. Everybody can do some kind of artistic act. You just actually have to bother seeing it through. Find a good idea, develop it, question it, work with it. And it is kind of 99% effort, And I think across the kind of set of projects that we have on the go at the moment, and there's something of that ethos that is now in play in all of them.
So let's move on to how you collaborate. With collaborators, you have to externalize things. It has to be spoken about. Do you think of the creative process and collaboration as a real workable thing?
It's the process by which stuff gets done. It's the process by which you stop yourself digging into those interminable internal cycles of doubt and self-confidence and lack of self-confidence that I think, for me, I feel like I would just be lost in. And I think through working collaboratively together for such a long time, it has enabled us, and it's perhaps taught us how to collaborate well with others. So over the years, I think our work has had this sort of expanding palette of collaborators, for the want of a better word, that 20,000 Days on Earth was probably the kind of the peak of that particular mountain, in the sense that a feature-length film takes a lot of collaboration. It takes a big army of people to get it done. You can't really be the sole artistic genius in the middle of it, or it ain't ever going to happen.
It's never been easy, though. I think we probably collaborate more effectively with other people than I often feel we do with each other. I think because we live together and we've built our life around our work and around our togetherness, it isn't the kind of excessive, constant, bubbling hive of creativity. It's an elusive, slippery battle with something you just don't understand. And some conditions help, that we can go through phases of, oh, if we go out for a walk every day, it's, you just find yourself talking, and that seems to really help. But that never, it never stays that way. It's constantly trying to somehow evade you. Maybe that's what keeps it interesting in some ways, is that it isn't easy.
Well, I think the fact that it's hard won is what makes you able to be confident in it when it is working, because you've already sort of had those checks and balances have kind of already been run between the two of you. And I guess that's what I mean about not really now knowing how I would operate on my own as a single creative entity, because I think I would still be looking for that dialogue, that conversation from someone, even if it wasn't directly a creative collaborator, if it was only just phoning a mate or something. I think I would still need that ability to externalize, verbalize.
It's maybe because I don't think, your opinions and even your instincts are not formed in a vacuum. They don't come out of you fully honed. For most people, they're a constant kind of work in progress, depending on what you're reading, depending on the people around you and their opinions. And I think it's that sense that when they align, when both of our instincts, both of our kind of opinions on something feel like they get into a groove with each other, then it's really rewarding, because then you kind of know you're onto something. You know that, and you can move quick in. And I think we really enjoy that it enables us to make really quick decisions, because it's as simple as, do we both feel that or not? And if we both feel it, you follow those feelings.
So it seems that Samuel Beckett became your most enduring inspiration. So his Not I from 1972, performed by Billy Whitlaw, is something you often return to. Do you want to tell me about that?
I would add Lindsay Anderson to. It's the same thing that I love in both of them. And it's that the real kind of singular ambition of voice, of idea, and how often it fails because it's so kind of big. But in encountering it, in watching Anderson's films or in experiencing Beckett's plays, you can't help but sort of be in awe of that ambition, in awe of their sort of visionariness or the epicness of what they're attempting. Gets you every time.
Yeah, I think there's something about humour as well that has always been really important to us, and I think something that particularly appeals to me is people that can almost smuggle humour into works that perhaps on the surface feel quite serious or feel quite epic or feel quite important in some way, yet somehow within that there's still a sort of just a little needle poking at something. And I think there's always been that desire to marry that sort of a serious intent with an undermining.
Yeah, I think Beckett's also the closest you get to installation work on the stage. The thinking, the kind of that it is a state, that you're invited to kind of exist within a state for a period of time. And that kind of defines to me what installation art is, what installation work is. And I think I find that the language of installation that I really love is the same language I find in Beckett. I find that notion of that it just happens to also have actors, people embodying kind of elements and ideas in it, makes it all the stronger.
So music continues to play a very big part in your life and your work, especially music from 1973, which is around the time you were born. But so the groups include the New York Dolls, Lou Reed, John Cale, the Stooges, David Bowie. And you've said that music is time travel, and a few notes are all it takes to derail the conscious mind and let the past come flooding through. So what is it about music that keeps you returning to it?
1973 is one of those weird, sort of almost magical ciphers that just somehow keeps returning in most of the projects we end up doing. I don't quite know what it is about that year that seems to have, I don't know, but it just, you can almost second guess if there's something that we've kind of unearthed somewhere, some piece of research we're doing, that at some point some 1973 related significance will somehow pop out of the woodwork.
I think, and I've never tried to articulate this before. Going back to when we were at Goldsmiths and that connection between wanting to make art that somehow had the relationship with the audience that we were witnessing in independent music. Going back to then, we understood absolutely in a sort of theoretical way in the power of music or in what it was making possible. We had an amazing set of kind of tutors, Sarat Maharaj being notably one of the ones who really changed us in his kind of teachings on James Joyce and Richard Hamilton and Duchamp, really kind of opened us up. Because maybe we didn't say this before, we both didn't know, but we picked the wrong course at Goldsmiths. So Goldsmiths has an art department which has this kind of smaller course, which is art and art theory, and then it has the bigger course, which is just art practice. And of course, I didn't realise there was a difference between these. I just thought, well, of course you want to try and you want to look at the kind of theory of art at the same time as you're making it. That's the right course to make. So a lot of our kind of anger and frustration came from being on the underdog course, the course that was, kept in a kind of dirty old mechanics garage across the road, whilst the kind of main art course was housed in the great Goldsmiths building. And so we were always fighting some kind of small battle to be heard or to be kind of taken as seriously as the other course. But I think that in being asked to read and think and write around not just your own practice, but around kind of other people's practices and other thinkers, it really helps you to begin to kind of look at those things that you understand instinctively to be able to unpick them. And we wrote a piece way back then about music. We wrote a piece about the iPod, and they just brought out the shuffle, totally new to the market, advertising absolutely everywhere. And we were fascinated by how this little thing that you hung around your neck and, loaded up with all your favourite tunes, but how the random shuffle thing would, what impact that would have on you, that you're no longer listening to these almost curated albums or these kind of toiled over mixtapes that that somebody's made for you, and the kind of the way a song ends and you're preempting the next song. But somehow this kind of weird, fatalistic, in the lap of the gods, small bit of plastic was just, randomly pulling up something and kind of pushing it into your ears. And we wrote a lot about this idea of how that might really derail your consciousness or how it might prompt a form of kind of time and space travel because of the associations connected to some of those songs, and how that could almost happen in a sort of spontaneous way, in a way that you had no control over because of the music being kind of randomly punched at you.
So that leads right into the next question. Your very first video is Chainsmoker Tap Dancer from 1995. And it's a 2-monitor installation with a pair of unedited single-take videos of nonstop actions that each of you performed. The top monitor features a single shot of Iain's head, presented actual size as he chain smokes. The second monitor, placed at foot level, features a single shot of Jane's feet wearing tap shoes and tap dancing. Iain doesn't speak or make a sound. Jane's tap dancing is the only sound of the piece. Was this about self-portraiture?
I guess it was about two things. It was about, on the one hand, I think, as looking at experiences prior to meeting each other and trying to sort of offer up something of a hint at what that life perhaps was. And on the other, I think something that we only really came to understand properly in retrospect was that I think we were in our own way going on a very similar journey to the journey that a lot of artists of a much earlier generation had been through as the kind of technology to video record had become available. So we found ourselves at Goldsmiths at a time where, video technology was relatively affordable, not really affordable to you as a student. It was kind of still unlikely you could go out and buy a camera, but the college had a store of equipment you could go and, book out and experiment with. So we had access to these, I think they were probably VHS cameras that we could play with, and we would just find ourselves sort of booking a room and booking a camera and just playing, just experimenting. And of course, with the glorious benefit of hindsight, you realise that's exactly what people were doing with Portapacks and all sorts of various technology over the years. But I guess it also goes back to that idea of something that feels quite formal and quite presented. It feels like video art in some sense, but is also pricked with that kind of humour of the sort of ludicrousness of these repetitive actions.
Quite a few recurring motifs in our practice, I think, were kind of solidified in the making of that piece. The use of real-time single take, that performance to camera, the power of understanding there is no trick in the edit. This entity inside this monitor exists in the same time as you, and in a way is in just an extension of the space that you're in. So the boxing and the ability to have real size head, real size feet, I think they're things we've always gone back to. They're things that are there in everything, and maybe it just is that simple urge, if you want to be able to connect with your viewer on a visceral, immediate level, that being in the same kind of time zone, being in an extension of their space and being the same size as them, that somehow that gives you something in common immediately. It gives you a kind of way of understanding something immediately. We had to do the smoking one first because we weren't sure how many cigarettes he was going to manage to smoke. I knew I could tap dance for as long as you needed, but it was interesting because we had to do the smoking one first, and then a sort of rather sick, grey-looking Iain had to film the tap dancing one.
Yeah. I mean, it was, the joke, I suppose, as it were, was that before we'd met, Jane had studied at stage school, and perhaps in a parallel universe somewhere is right now dancing on a stage somewhere. That's a life she may have had, whereas I was standing around some dirty venue somewhere watching a crappy rock and roll band and smoking cigarettes. So that was kind of the gag.
The notion of the video camera becoming a co-conspirator or a third silent collaborator. Do you think about that?
Yeah, I think we'd seen that actually for us, the first encounter with that was Gilbert and George's work in the stills camera. Perhaps way before we kind of got to know Akonshi or Nauman and really sort of witness exactly what we'd been through in their work. But no, Gilbert and George. And I think that idea of the kind of the double act as well. I mean, I don't think that we would ever have considered working together had it not have been for Gilbert and George. I think they showed us a template that made that feasible. Because the only other collaborators I guess we knew at the time were all siblings. We were tutored by Jane and Louise Wilson, only ever one at a time because they would only pay them one fee. So we'd have week on, week off, Jane or Louise. And we knew Jake Chapman, the Chapman brothers, through Joshua. So I think we kind of maybe thought that you had to be related to collaborate, or that somehow that would add to it. But of course in comedy you see the kind of Morecambe and Wise and the Laurel and Hardy, and there was something of that kind of humour in Gilbert and George as well. I think they were, there's no way we'd have even known to collaborate had it not have been for them.
So another topic that we could touch on, which is the history of technology, which is of interest to you. And that topic is at the heart of your work that I selected for the exhibition Seeing Sound, Requiem for 114 Radios. So it's a looped sound installation with mixed media, including filing cabinets, a tinkerer's workbench, electronic apparatus, and 114 analog radios scattered around the room. So I love how the installation appears to be an anonymous archive or the abandoned workshop of a radio enthusiast. So each radio frequency is playing a vocalist singing a dramatic new version of Dies Irae from the Roman Catholic Requiem Mass. Dies Irae was interpreted by such composers as Verdi and Mozart and used to very chilling effect by Stanley Kubrick in A Clockwork Orange and The Shining. So to me, Requiem for 114 Radios is a testament to the death of analog technology. Mysterious messages, modulated hisses, mangled voices, incomprehensible words. So what were you thinking about when you made the work?
It's almost technology come full circle. When radio was first invented, there was discussion, there was the possibility that one might pick up a voice from the ether, that one might be able to hear the communications of the dead somehow lost within these airwaves. And it feels like the technology has kind of been, through its sort of functional mainstream safe space and is now returning back to that original space of feeling somehow liminal, of feeling that it might be capable of something kind of supernatural or extraordinary in some way.
Or extraterrestrial.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of incredible, I think, that radio waves is kind of the thing that we expect will be the way that we'll receive communication from, out there. This idea that kind of radio, which feels like such an out-of-date, such an analog, faded technology, could be the thing that potentially shepherds the kind of greatest leap of, human understanding. It's kind of amazing.
And that, I think radio is associated with authority of some sort, that somehow the right to broadcast brings with it a kind of an authority in the voice of that. That might be how you learn about war or how you find out the truth. Even now, if something's kind of sparking off on Twitter, I'm turning the radio on. I want to know what the BBC are saying. There's still this a sort of odd distrust of the ability for internet kind of digital technology to somehow be, as we've seen in the last few years of politics, to be heavily manipulated and manipulative, that you're looking for a truth beyond that. And I think radio brings with it an idea of truth. So the idea was such a simple one. The 114 came from Kubrick, the sort of number. We just knew we needed a kind of a number that you couldn't count, a number that was like a big choir. And we found the 114 in Kubrick's work. And then we couldn't approach 114 people, but we knew we could approach 14 singers to all perform the same piece. And I love it. It's oddly one of the only pieces that I think we've made that I really enjoy being inside, that I really love it, because it's affected by the body as well, because there's so much kind of, there's 14 transmitters and 114 radios picking up on 14 FM, live FM, kind of locally broadcast signals, that as you move around the room and as your heat and your own kind of static electricity kind of shifts around the space, it kind of plays into the piece. The radios crackle, and I don't know, there's something really lovely about it.
It's an unpredictability, isn't it? And I think that's probably something that keeps drawing us back to these kind of technologies like radio, like analog tape, like live performance. These are all sort of situations where at some point you relinquish control to something greater than you, outside of your sort of own sphere of control, is suddenly kind of broken by these things like FM transmission or analog tape or a performer on a stage that isn't you. And I think that takes us right back to this idea of the relationship with music. And again, one of the great joys of music performed live and the live music experience is that it is unpredictable. It has the potential to be something other than the simulation of the live recording. Nobody wants to go to see a live show to hear something that sounds exactly like the record you could have played at home. You're going to see something that is slightly different, slightly unpredictable.
Yeah, to share in something or to feel something beyond what's able to be captured on a, slab of vinyl. And I think that's very true of radio. Of course, what we also have is the whole cultural history of the radio as well. So the way that it has kind of played out in horror films, that's loaned to the use of it now. That we're able to kind of, a lot of sort of supernatural films I can think of that have kind of voices that are coming through on a radio, or where the kind of signal is weak but it's somehow kind of haunted. They come with a lot of baggage, a lot of good baggage.
You've worked with many different organizations, private, public institutions, commercial galleries, and film distributors. So how do you separate the art and the cinema? Or do you?
I think, honestly, we don't. But I think the industries themselves kind of create a fairly natural and unavoidable division just through very practical concerns. I think in our heads, it's all part of the same practice. Someone asked us the other day whether we thought of ourselves as artists or filmmakers, or artist filmmakers. And our answers were different, actually. But my answer was that I still and always have thought of us as artists, because to me that's, the attraction of art school in a way all those years ago was that artist seems to be that sort of magic word that allows you to spin in any direction. There isn't a door closed. As an artist, it feels like the moment you attach any other definition, to be a filmmaker, you shouldn't really be dabbling in sound installations because that's the job of someone else. Whereas artist feels like the key that unlocks all the doors.
I think there are kind of modes of operating that we've definitely brought back to our art from our experience of working with film production companies and distributors and execs and sales agents and stuff, where even as a kind of auteur director, you're not completely sort of trusted, if you like, to fully kind of conceive and deliver every last detail of something in the way that you would be as an artist, that you are the one and only you that kind of does that. And it's been really useful. I mean, I've loved it. I really thrived. And maybe it won't be the same on film number 2, but I really thrived on 20,000 Days having these, we were sitting around with really incredible, intelligent women exec producers who were all hungry to kind of input ideas, but weren't pushing any of them. They weren't saying it has to be this way. They were just asking questions. What happens if you do this? Why aren't you captioning when we're moving from the studio in France to the psychoanalyst's interview? Do we need to understand that these are in different places or in different time frames? And just even having somebody kind of pose that question, it helps you to kind of understand your own stance on it. Like for us, it was an immediately like, well, no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to the audience that, because in a way, Nick's the one that's kind of taking you through both of these spaces. And you just have to trust in him, and we don't need to label that, and nor do we need to acknowledge the surface of the screen. That that in itself, putting type onto the surface of the screen, kind of reminds our viewer that they're watching a flat representation of something, an illusion, a not real thing. Whereas whilst we can play with durational time, extension of space, and somehow kind of real life size in some way, then you can be lost to that a little bit. You can kind of slip into a world where, you're completely kind of absorbed in what you're watching.
And that's sort of relationships that I guess we've never really had in the art world. I don't know if other artists would feel the same, or perhaps they have a different sort of feedback loop that creates that for them. But I think our experience has very much been that within the art world, it's really once you've completed a project and you sort of present it to the world, that suddenly normally there's a whole queue of people willing to tell you, what you've done wrong, what you should have done, and so on. And that's the point where you get public feedback. You get perhaps press and journalists tell you what you should have done differently, or what they think of what you were trying to do. But to have that sort of formalized within the creative process, where there are these stages where you, as a group of people, will review work, will discuss ideas, will collaborate, I think was really unusual for us, and a really valuable process that I think we're now trying to find ways to replicate within the rest of our practice.
I can really understand how in certain areas of the history of our practice where there have been incredibly influential sort of creative producers, and I think we now acknowledge that we really thrive with that relationship. The producer that we worked with on 20,000 Days, he's key to kind of the way in which we shape and sort of place how we're doing what we do. But we have had some interesting relationships in our art practice. There was Vivian Gaskin at the ICA, who commissioned a load of the early performance work, and now realised that we were really collaborating. There was that sense that the kind of together, the sort of bounce between us. It was quite a sort of, she kind of operated like a creative producer. There was Elisabetta Fabrizi, who opened the BFI gallery when it briefly had this kind of incredible space for experimentation. And again, I feel like with her, we operated in a different way. There was more kind of back and forth. And then we have some of those relationships in some of our regular collaborators, whether they're actors or, well, I think of Raj Patel at Arup. He's in the New York office of Arup, but he has been involved in so much of our work. And again, kind of where he sits, maybe you'd call him a kind of technological consultant or an acoustics consultant to our practice, but it's much more than that, because we bounce off him all the time, the kind of ideas of, but what if, but how could, reverse that, and it's such a sort of creative relationship.
So what's next for you?
Who knows? Who knows? This situation is so strange. The year we thought we were going to have, which was filled with incredible, exciting projects, is not the year that I think we're now going to have. But over the last couple of weeks, some really interesting kind of possibilities have reared their head. I think over the last few years, the one thing that we have been really kind of aware of is that you never quite know when the conditions, the sort of aligning of conditions, is going to be right for one project to really pick up. And that's definitely come with the sort of straddling of two industries. I think if we were just operating in the art world, then you can have a lot more control. Whereas the moment you're trying to kind of straddle into television and online media and particularly film, you lose a lot of that control because it's attached to money.
Yeah, I mean, we'd been, for the greatest part of this year, we'd been working on co-curating an exhibition that was due to open at Somerset House in September, which is now sadly postponed due to the pandemic. So that got put on hold. And weirdly, we were also kind of involved in another exhibition that has been put on hold, which was a Nick Cave exhibition in Copenhagen. And we had assisted in 2 rooms of that exhibition. So one of them is a recreation of the office that appears in our film, which itself was a kind of reimagining of what Nick Cave's office perhaps should look like. So just before lockdown hit, we were in Copenhagen dressing and creating a fake office for Nick Cave and a gallery.
I know what I want to happen next. I want to make another film. We're having a lot of ideas that straddle that kind of, well, it's now called hybrid documentary. But for us, it's always just that lovely slippery area between sort of true and false, authentic and inauthentic.
So the very last question, which I think you've already kind of answered, but this is the question I'm asking everybody I speak with in the series. Do you consider yourselves media artists?
I don't mind you considering us media artists.
I think, again, the word media feels like it closes some other doors. And I sort of maintain this idea that artist is like the skeleton key that opens all the doors. So I would consider media art part of our practice. I would still consider us to be artists, able to open all the doors. Not necessarily successfully, but at least allowed to try.
Well, I think you open lots of doors, and you've opened lots of doors for me, because I've so enjoyed every time I talk with you, whether that was the very first time at the BFA when you had the installation there, and then over these years. So I hope we can get together in the same room,
Soon.
same place, soon.
We'd love that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On behalf of Iain Forsyth and Jane Pollard, thanks for joining me for this episode of Barbara London Calling. Support for Barbara London Calling is generously provided by Bobby Cochet and Independent Curators International in conjunction with their upcoming exhibition, Seeing Sound, which I curated. Be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all the latest episodes. Follow us on Instagram at Barbara London Calling, and check out barbaralondon.net for transcripts of each episode and links to the works discussed. Barbara London Calling is produced by Bauer Blue, with lead producer Ryan Leahy and audio engineer Ammar Ibrahim. Special thanks to La Tigra for graciously providing our music. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.